Welcome, everyone. Today, me, along with my principal consultant, Graham, will discuss operational efficiency in the world of SIEM. In the ever evolving landscape of cyber threats, I think staying ahead of the curve is no easy feat. Security, information, and event management, SIEM system plays a vital role for any organization who are looking to improve the overall security posture. However, a poorly configured or a functioning SIEM solution can create a false sense of security, and it can leave your network vulnerable. So, me and Graham will discuss some of the telltale signs that your SIEM might not be performing as it should be. We have divided into multiple categories. And the first category that we'll be focusing around is around data ingestion and the correlation issues. Uh, Things like data gaps and inconsistencies are uh, I have seen on numerous deployment are a cause are one of the main cause for your SIM may not work as efficiently as it should be. Things like, are you missing log data from important sources? Is the data that's being currently onboarded is incomplete or inaccurate within the environment? In other terms, is your data hygiene not up to the mark? This can severely hinder the same ability to detect and analyze security events effectively. Uh, Overall, I would say data hygiene plays a vital role. Graham, do you have anything else to add around this?
Yeah, just so really data gaps and onboarding data feeds really this to me is about
Mhm.
using techniques to onboard sample sets of the data. So bringing some data into the SIEM, having a look to see that we've got all the fields we need, just kind of walking through it as a kind of a pre-run exercise just before we do the final ingest and make that available to teams. And obviously, reading that in conjunction with onboarding best practices, vendors write a lot of material about how to ingest data, and they even give kind of data models for data fields that you can extract. Some of them, support and provide things like lookups as well. So yeah, they're my kind of top two tips for data ingestion and
Mhm.
correlating.
Okay. So another reason why data gaps and inconsistencies can become an issue down the line is, let's say, for example, when you're trying to create a use cases, for example, let's take inside a use case to actually get a full timeline of a picture of a user's session during the timeline. You need data sources across all your estate, like Windows, VPN, endpoint, proxy. And if you miss some of these data points from an overall use case, you may not have the complete picture of user timeline. So that's where the gaps and inconsistencies can cause issues when you come to deliver your use cases and business case. So that's why prioritizing the data sources and onboarding them as per the best practices, which Graham mentioned, can alleviate some of the issues. So another issue that we do see in majority of the deployments are around alert overload or lack of relevant alerts. So things like SIM might be generating a high number of false alert or irrelevant alerts that can waste time and resources. And it also makes it difficult to identify genuine threats if you're overloaded with false alerts all the time. And also, genuine threats can be missed due to misconfiguration or inadequate correlation rules as well. I think Graham can touch upon a bit as well on this topic.
Yeah, definitely, Vinay. So I mean, we see this all the time. People are really eager to get into their SIEM. They've got data ingested, and they just want to switch on as much alerting to kind of see, some alerts against their data. And that's great because you do get some of those things that you can go off and investigate, but ultimately you get into this position where you can't see the wood for the trees. You just get a flurry of different coloured alerts, and I think the way we've seen successful SIEM deployments is working those with use cases, obviously, but just enable them when you know it's something that fits in with your business. You can follow it through to make sure that the data alerting is really what you want to see in that alert. So it's just, only turn them on kind of when you've got a full use case for understanding, the the flow of that, so the data, what you're expected to see, but more importantly how you're going to act upon that alert as well, because there's no point
Yeah.
just having a load of alerts that are just sitting there but nobody's actioning them. So yeah, that's my key takeaway for those.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing that leads on to the next point, which is around high number of false alerts or irrelevant alerts, it can reduce your performance of your scene. So if you're seeing things like if seeing SIM to ingest and process data, taking long time to do that, so it will also make it difficult to get real-time insights if this is happening across your environment. So dashboards may be slow to load or unresponsive. Your reports may not be generating when you need them. So all these issues around data ingestion gaps, inconsistencies, alert overload can directly relate to slow performance of your SIEM. And this can also impede your timely incident response that you can take within the solution as well. Yeah. Graham, do you like to add anything at this point?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of points on that. So, like you said, Vinay, it's about planning. So the capacity, and that's not just about license. So a lot of people see this as, SIEM usage models are based on license, and how much we're indexing impedes the license. It's more about the compute. So like you've pointed out. But also to consider the compute resource of where the event logs, so where the sources are coming from. Obviously, that cloud egress costs, so that there's that whole kind of capacity. I know that's not directly impacting the SIEM, but this should all be kind of formulated together to give that view to understand how the SIEM is going to operate efficiently. Things like, can you support the investigations? So if you've got misconfigurations of data, so if you're taking on a very bespoke data source, have you got somebody that can understand how that data is constructed, how best to extract it from that environment, what fields are in
Yeah.
there, so that when we put that into the SIEM, we've got fields that either align to a common information model, or they've got some meaningful value rather than just saying, yeah, we're on board in it. Because again, doing those operations on that data can have a detrimental effect depending on where and how you do them on the SIEM. And then the last one, I guess, really is about prioritizing the use cases. So if we want to get the most value from our SIEM, let's model those use cases around what really does affect the business. Because if we set out to achieve hundreds and hundreds of use cases, with a low and high value, those lower ones can actually impact the SIEM in a negative way, like
Right.
from a performance and from an operational perspective. So, yeah, they're my kind of top three experiences, I guess.
That's great because I resonate with most of the topics or your top three that you went through. So another reason why your team may be operating ineffectively may lead to lack of effective monitoring and reporting. I think we already touched upon a bit. So what in this category we're gonna go through in much more detail. So let's say if you don't have a defined security use cases and priorities set, so then it becomes very difficult to actually monitor your critical assets if you don't know what your critical assets are. So if you don't know what percentage of your estate being monitored, is everything you want to monitor is currently being monitored. So I think even before you start with your SIEM deployments, you need to understand your data sources and prioritize those data sources with the use cases that you want to achieve while using your SIEM. So that way, the SIEM deployment and SIEM can work effectively and efficiently for you. Um, Again, we touched upon around ineffective reporting and incident response. Uh, so alert overload and slowness of SIM can lead into ineffective reporting and incidents not being delivered in timely manner. So what organizations do sometimes is use tools like SOAR to automate incident response workflows to facilitate investigation. But the problem with that is if your team is not working effectively or efficiently, then there's a high chance of your SOAR not working up to its ability as well because SIEM feeds the data to SOAR for automation. So, inability to effectively communicate and respond to security events can leave your organization vulnerable to attacks. Uh, Graham, do you want to add anything with this category as well?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said there. And just to expand on that further, we go to a lot of customers where it's quite challenging to identify what those critical assets and those more vulnerable identities are. A lot of organizations, for the assets we use the CMDB. That's not always, either up to date or it's got its challenges. But I mean, the thing I'd say, as long as the use cases are built to consider those critical assets and identities, um, we can start building out this material. So, not directly impacting the seam, but I can kind of guess impacting the overall delivery. And just things to consider are, if we start pulling data from multiple sources,
Hmm.
once we start utilizing the seam, what the impact on things like searches, things like cross data source searches, all that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a load to be considered there, but like you say, I think it needs to be identified early on, and then we can start building out the seam.
Yeah, definitely. I think CMDB does play a vital role, even though it's not related to your SIP deployment in identifying and prioritizing your asset. So as long as you have an up-to-date CMDB, which in itself is very challenging, I think you are in a good position when it comes to your SIM deployment to make it efficient and successful. So another reason why we think your SIM may be struggling and operating is because around configuration and maintenance problem, although this can be reduced, let's say if you're using a SaaS based deployment, whereas if you're still on-prem and managing that on your own is still valid. And majority of the reasons that we went through earlier are still relevant even if you're SaaS or on-prem. So things like alert overload, ineffective slowness of the SIEM solution, no defined use cases and priorities, they're still valid, or data caps inconsistent, they're still valid even if you are on cloud or on-prem. Whereas things like outdated rules and signatures may not be as relevant as in SaaS as it's in on-prem, because let's say with SaaS, vendors may release quarterly or monthly content pack update, which gets updated automatically. Whereas if it's on-prem, you need a team or resource to do that manually, or at least automate the process so that you can improve your use cases to be able to identify latest and evolving threats. So another reason why we think configuration will cause an issue or will cause SIM to run effectively is around identifying the log retention and storage. I think Graham touched upon this earlier a bit. So one thing to note down is uh, you need to understand how long you want to retain your data to facilitate your incident investigation and forensic analysis. Right? It may be for your compliance, it may be for threat hunting, forensic, whatever the use case may be. This needs to be identified at the beginning of your SIEM deployment so that there is sufficient storage available for all your investigation and analysis. Things like Splunk nowadays, or tools like Splunk nowadays, can also support object storage like S3 for longer retention of the data with reduced cost. So you can utilize that within Splunk to reduce the amount you spend on your storage as well. I think last thing is really important, and I don't think I can express it enough, is around limited user training and adoption. So I think getting your security analyst properly trained on the tool that you're using, whatever tool that may be on SIEM efficiently, is very critical. So poor adoption can limit the SIEM value and effectiveness, especially when there is already a resource shortage within the field. Anything you want to touch upon there, Graham?
Yeah, so just a couple of points. I guess not directly associated with performance of the seam, but it is in terms of when we scale or when we design seams, and it's around kind of user access, user roles. So just staying on top of making sure that the right people have got access, and they've got the right level of access. If obviously we've got stale users, they don't impact the performance, but from a security perspective, obviously we've got lots of valuable data sets in here, so we just need to be aware or cognizant of the fact that they've got some pretty high level access. And I guess the last one really, it feeds into some of the earlier points we made, is about just updating vendors, add-ons or packs. So this is where, say, somebody like Microsoft would provide a pack to extract Windows logs. Just about keeping on top of those, because we've seen many instances where vendors update these, but they've made fundamental changes to the fields that they call certain objects within either their systems, their applications, and they change, so they're no longer aligned with how we're pulling that
Yeah.
data. So there's lots of examples of this, but just really making sure as a maintenance task, we just keep on top of those add-ons just to make sure that our alerts are triggering properly, but they are exposing those fields that we think they should be exposing. So yeah, no, that's my final point.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. And I think if you see all these signs that me and Graham are mentioning, I think it's high time to evaluate your SIEM effectiveness. So consider consulting with security experts or SIEM vendor to diagnose the issues or the problem and to implement improvements. I remember a well-functioning SIEM solution can be an asset in your cybersecurity arsenal, but only if it's configured, maintained, and utilized properly. Performing a SIM health check is vital, and our recommendation is that you do this often, regularly, as much as possible, at least once every quarter or every 6 months. Um, of course, if you need any assistance, RiverSafe are here to help you. Yeah, that's about it from me and Graham for today. Look out for our next video around SIEM optimization. Thanks everyone for joining in. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.